I never expected that joining a church choir to feel a little less lonely would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when the director held the final note of my solo, and then held me. It started, as these things often do, not with a crash of cymbals, but with the quiet hum of a life that felt just a little too settled, a little too predictable. My name is Lucas, and at the time, my world was mostly confined to the four walls of my apartment and the glowing rectangle of my computer screen. I was a graphic designer, which is a modern way of saying I was a professional hermit. My days had a rhythm, a steady and unremarkable beat. Wake up, coffee, work, lunch, work, dinner, maybe a movie, sleep. It was a safe existence, but safety can start to feel a lot like isolation after a while. The silence in my apartment had become a presence of its own, a roommate I had never invited. That's why I joined the choir at St. Jude's. I wasn't particularly devout, but I missed the feeling of voices rising together, of being a small part of something larger and more beautiful than myself. It was a calculated step toward connection, a way to punctuate the silence once a week. St. Jude's was the kind of church that smelled of history. Old wood, beeswax, and a faint, sweet hint of frankincense that clung to the velvet cushions. The stained glass windows threw fractured jewels of light across the stone floor, and the acoustics were a singer's dream. Every note seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than it should, cushioned by the vast, vaulted ceiling. I found a spot in the back row of the tenor section, a comfortable place to observe, to contribute without being noticed. It was enough for a while. And then there was Julian. He was the choir director, the architect of the sound we all tried to build. From my vantage point, he was a study in controlled passion. He didn't just conduct. He seemed to pull the music directly from the air with his hands, shaping it, quieting it, urging it to swell. He had dark, unruly hair that fell across his forehead when he got truly lost in a piece, and intense eyes that seemed to see right through you, to the note you were about to sing. He was confident, focused, and utterly dedicated. He'd stop us mid-phrase, his head cocked to the side. Altos, you're dragging. Sopranos, I need more air, less force. Tenors, listen to each other. His feedback was always precise, never unkind, but it carried an authority that commanded respect. To me, he was an untouchable figure, existing on a different plane of existence. He was the artist. I was just one of the colors on his palette. And, of course, I assumed he was straight. It was a default setting, a self-protective mechanism I had honed over years of quiet observation. He was talented, handsome, and in charge. In my world, men like that were never looking for men like me. So I kept my head down, sang my parts, and admired him from a safe distance. This routine of quiet admiration and weekly harmony continued for months. It was a pleasant, low-stakes addition to my life. I'd go to rehearsal on Wednesday nights, feel that flicker of connection, and then retreat back into my comfortable solitude. I felt less lonely, but I was still alone. I had accepted this as my new normal. But here's the thing about life, isn't it? The moment you get comfortable, it tends to find a way to shake things up. It doesn't always wait for you to be ready. Our comfortable routine was shattered by the impending arrival of Easter. Easter at St. Jude's wasn't just about lilies and pastel hats. It was a major musical event. The centerpiece of the service was a notoriously difficult cantata, a sprawling piece full of complex harmonies and soaring solos. It was Julian's favorite, and his excitement was palpable, bordering on manic. He pushed us harder than ever before, his energy filling the rehearsal space, demanding we rise to meet the challenge of the music. During one particularly grueling rehearsal, we were working on a quiet, transitional movement. It featured a short but incredibly poignant solo for a tenor. It was only 4 bars long, but it had to be perfect. It was the emotional turning point of the entire piece, a moment of pure, vulnerable prayer before the triumphant finale. Julian had the entire tenor section sing it together, over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration. He stood before us, his eyes closed, just listening. Again, he commanded, his voice quiet but firm. We sang it again. He held up a hand, and the sound died away. He opened his eyes, and they scanned our row, lingering for a moment on each face. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I tried to make myself smaller, to blend into the man standing next to me. But his eyes found mine, and they stopped. "Lucas," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice, so rarely spoken directly to me, sent a jolt through my system. "Sing it for me." Alone, the other 20 people in the room seemed to melt away. There was only the heavy silence, the weight of his gaze, and the sheet music in my trembling hands. I took a breath, the air feeling thin and inadequate, and I sang. The notes came out shakily at first, then gained strength as I focused on the page, on the story the music was telling. For those few seconds, I forgot to be nervous. I just sang. When the last note faded into the cavernous space of the sanctuary, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was full, resonant with the ghost of the sound. Julian was still looking at me, his expression unreadable. I braced myself for a correction, a polite dismissal. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That's it," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "That's the vulnerability it needs." He then addressed the whole choir, moving on to the next section as if nothing monumental had happened. But for me, everything had shifted. Later, as we were all packing up, he approached me. "Lucas, can you stay for a few minutes? I'd like to work on that with you, just to be sure." My heart hammered against my ribs. Sure. Yeah, of course, it was a simple, professional request. It was his job, but it felt like a door had been opened, a door I never even knew existed. The others filed out, their cheerful chatter fading down the hallway, until it was just me and Julian, alone in the vast, echoing church. This was the moment it all began. The moment the music and my life started to change. So there we were, the enormous sanctuary of St. Jude's, lit by only a few dim service lights, felt both imposing and strangely intimate. The stained glass windows were dark, inscrutable patches against the night sky. The air was cool and still. It was just me, Julian, and the grand piano that sat like a sleeping beast near the chancel steps. He sat down on the bench and gestured for me to stand nearby. The familiar energy of the bustling rehearsal was gone, replaced by a focused quiet that felt heavy with possibility. "Let's just run it a few times," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to perfectly suit the space. "Don't think about it as a performance. Just feel the words." He played the introductory chords, the notes rich and full in the silence. I took a breath and sang. My voice felt small and exposed without the support of the other tenors around me. He stopped me after the second bar. "You have a beautiful, clear tone, Lucas," he said, and the direct compliment made warmth spread across my chest. "But you're protecting it. You're holding back." He looked up at me from the piano bench, his gaze direct. "This solo isn't about being pretty. It's about being broken. It's a plea. Can you give me that?" We spent the next hour on those 4 bars of music. It was the most intense musical instruction I had ever received. He was no longer the distant conductor on the podium. He was a partner, a guide. He had me sing it standing, sitting, with my eyes closed. He talked about the context of the piece, not in technical terms, but in emotional ones. He wasn't just directing me. He was inviting me into the heart of the music with him. This shared time felt different, charged with a purpose that went beyond just getting the notes right. We were building something together, just the two of us. After one particularly draining run-through, he let his hands fall from the keys and leaned back with a sigh. "Let's take a break." He rubbed his eyes, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion etched around them. The confident, indefatigable director was gone, and in his place was just a man who looked tired. He seemed more real, more accessible than he ever had from the back row. "You okay?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He gave a small, weary smile. "Yeah, just this piece. It means a lot." He paused, looking not at me, but at the grand altar in the distance. "My professor in conservatory, the man who taught me everything I know about conducting, he loved this cantata more than anything. He passed away a couple of years ago. Every time I conduct it, I feel like I have to get it perfect. For him, you know." And there it was, a small crack in the polished facade. This wasn't just a job for him. It was deeply personal. He was sharing a piece of his history, a sliver of his own vulnerability. The pressure he put on us, on himself, wasn't just about professional pride. It was about love and memory and grief. Seeing him like this, stripped of his conductor's authority and just speaking as a person carrying a quiet weight, it changed everything. He wasn't the untouchable artist anymore. He was human. "I'm sorry about your professor," I said softly. It must be hard, carrying that. It is, he admitted, his eyes finally meeting mine. But it's a good weight, too. It reminds me why I do this. He stood up from the piano bench and walked over to where I was standing. Okay, let's try it one more time. But this time, I want you to think about posture before I could process what was happening. He was standing behind me. You're slouching just a little. It closes off your diaphragm. His hands came to rest on my shoulders. The touch was light, clinical, and yet it felt like a brand. I could feel the warmth of his palms through the thin fabric of my shirt. My entire body went rigid. Just relax your shoulders, he said, his voice a low hum near my ear. He gently pressed down, and I forced myself to obey, to let my shoulders drop. There. Now, ground yourself. Feel your feet on the floor. His hands slid from my shoulders down my back. Just for a second, a brief, tracing gesture meant to align my spine. The touch lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it recalibrated my entire universe. It was a professional correction, nothing more. A director helping a singer with their technique, right? But the careful way his fingers had moved, the brief, solid pressure of his hands, it felt significant. It felt like a message written in a language I was only just beginning to understand. He stepped away, back to the piano, and the absence of his touch was more startling than its presence had been. From the top, he said, his voice perfectly normal. I sang, and this time, the notes were full of everything I couldn't say. The final rehearsal was a hive of nervous energy. It was the night before the big Easter service, our last chance to run through the entire cantata. We weren't in the main rehearsal room. Instead, Julian had us gather in the sanctuary itself to get used to the space. For my solo, he had a specific idea. He wanted me to sing it from the organ balcony at the back of the church, letting the notes drift down over the congregation. It was a theatrical choice, but an effective one. The sound will be purer from up there, he explained. More ethereal. So while the rest of the choir took their places in the choir stalls up front, Julian led me up the narrow, winding stone staircase to the balcony. The space was smaller than I expected, dominated by the massive, gilded pipes of the organ. It was cramped and dusty, and we were suddenly standing very close to each other. The air was thick with the scent of old paper from the hymnals and a faint metallic tang from the organ itself. From this height, the pews below looked like a miniature, ordered forest. He positioned me near the railing. Don't worry about watching me, he said, his voice low. I'll be down there, but you know this piece by heart now. Just listen to the organ cue and sing. I'll be right here. I was confused. I had assumed he would go back down to conduct. You're staying? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. I want to hear how it sounds from up here. To make sure the balance is right. It was a plausible excuse, but my heart started a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Down below, the organist began the introduction. The deep, resonant chords vibrated up through the floorboards, through the soles of my shoes. Julian stood just behind me, his presence a warm, solid weight in the small space. I could feel him there, could almost hear him breathing. The cue came, that delicate, shimmering chord from the organ. I took a breath, the air tasting of dust and anticipation, and I opened my mouth. I sang, and for those 4 bars, the world ceased to exist. There was only the music, my voice, and the vast, holy space waiting to be filled. I poured every bit of the vulnerability Julian had asked for into the notes. The feeling of being broken, the plea, the quiet hope. I held the final note, letting it taper off into a whisper, feeling it hang in the air like a silver thread. It was the best I had ever sung it. I knew it, deep in my bones. The note faded into absolute silence. The organist below held the pause for a beat longer than written, letting the moment linger. And in that charged, perfect silence, it happened. I felt a subtle shift behind me, and then his hands came to rest on my waist. It wasn't a push or a pull. It was a simple, grounding placement. His palms were warm and firm against the sides of my body, his fingers resting just above my hips. It was not a director's touch. It was not a correction. It was an anchor. My breath hitched in my throat. Every nerve ending in my body was suddenly screamingly aware of the 2 points of contact where he was holding me. The touch was steady, possessive in the gentlest way, and it lasted through the entire, breathless pause. It felt like he was holding me together, keeping me from floating away on the echo of my own voice. It was an answer to a question I hadn't dared to ask. It was an affirmation, a confession made without a single word. Down below, the orchestra and choir swelled into the triumphant final movement, a glorious crash of sound that should have been overwhelming. But I barely heard it. All I could feel were his hands on my waist, a silent, profound gesture that had fundamentally altered the landscape of my world. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The moment felt both infinitely long and tragically brief. Then, as if waking from a dream, he slowly, reluctantly, pulled his hands away. The loss of contact was a physical ache. We didn't speak. We couldn't. There were no words for what had just passed between us in the dusty intimacy of the organ balcony. The air in the balcony was so thick I felt like I could barely draw a breath. The triumphant finale of the cantata was happening down below us, a storm of music and voices. But up here, in our small, shadowed space, a different kind of storm had just broken. Julian had taken a step back, putting a careful foot of distance between us. I could see his profile in the dim light filtering up from the sanctuary. His jaw was tight, his expression inscrutable. Did he regret it? Was he panicking? My mind was a frantic spiral of questions. When the piece finally concluded with a thunderous chord from the organ, he finally moved. He cleared his throat. The balance was good, he said, his voice strained and unnaturally formal. Very good. And then he turned and led the way back down the winding stone staircase, not looking back to see if I was following. The sudden shift from that intense, silent intimacy to this cold professionalism was like a physical blow. It left me reeling, confused, and utterly heartbroken. The performance the next day was a blur. I went through the motions, my mind 1,000 miles away, replaying that single moment in the balcony. When the time came for my solo, I walked up the stairs alone. Julian was on the conductor's podium this time, a remote figure under the bright lights. I sang the notes, but my heart wasn't in them. I was just a voice, a technical performer. The vulnerability from the night before was gone, replaced by a shield of anxious uncertainty. After the service, there was a small reception for the choir in the parish hall, a cacophony of cheerful chatter, coffee, and cookies. I tried my best to look normal. I accepted congratulations from other choir members with a tight, forced smile. "Your solo was beautiful, Lucas," they'd say, and I'd murmur a thank you, all the while scanning the room for Julian. I saw him across the hall, surrounded by members of the church council, laughing at something one of them said. He looked completely at ease, as if the moment between us had never happened, as if his hands had never settled on my waist and rearranged my entire world. Maybe I had imagined it all. That's what my brain, my self-protective, cautious brain, started to tell me. I had projected my own feelings onto a simple, encouraging gesture. He was just being a supportive director. The intimacy was a product of the late hour, the cramped space, the emotional music. I was an idiot. A hopeful, romantic idiot who had built a castle in the sky based on 5 seconds of physical contact. The hope that had bloomed so fiercely in my chest began to wither, replaced by the cold, familiar sting of foolishness. I felt a desperate need to escape. I couldn't stand being in that room, pretending to be cheerful while my insides were churning with a mixture of longing and humiliation. I slipped out of the parish hall, intending to just go home and bury myself in work, to forget the whole disastrous episode. I pushed open the heavy oak door that led back into the now empty sanctuary, seeking a moment of quiet before I faced the outside world. The church was silent again, just as it had been during our private rehearsals. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass, painting the stone floor in vibrant, shifting colors. The air smelled of snuffed candles and leftover incense. It was peaceful, but my heart was anything but. I was halfway to the main exit when a voice called my name from behind me. "Lucas." I froze, my hand on the handle of the great door. I turned slowly. It was Julian. He had followed me out of the reception. He stood at the other end of the main aisle, his choir robe shed, looking impossibly nervous. The confident conductor was gone again. In his place was the man I had seen in the quiet of our rehearsal, the man who carried a hidden weight. He started walking toward me, his footsteps echoing softly in the immense space. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. This was it, the conversation I was both dreading and praying for. He stopped a few feet in front of me, close enough that I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me with professional distance. He was looking at me with an unnerving, raw honesty. He took a breath, as if bracing himself. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the church, it sounded like a shout. "About what happened in the balcony." My throat was dry. I could only manage a single, tight nod. I stood there, rooted to the spot, bracing myself for the apology, the explanation, the gentle letdown that was sure to come. I prepared myself for him to tell me it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a moment of unprofessionalism he deeply regretted. I was ready for the confirmation that my hope had been completely and utterly misplaced. Julian ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure anxiety that I had never seen from him before. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, focusing instead on a point just over my shoulder. "Lucas, about the other night in the balcony," he began, his voice wavering slightly. I need to apologize. That was unprofessional of me. It was completely out of line." A cold wave of disappointment washed over me. There it was. The dismissal I had been steeling myself for. I had been a fool. I tried to assemble my features into a mask of polite understanding, to make this easy for both of us. "It's okay," I started to say, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "Don't worry about it. It was just the music, the moment." "No," he cut me off, his voice suddenly firm, his eyes finally locking onto mine. "No, it wasn't the music. It wasn't the moment. It was me." He took another step closer, closing the remaining distance between us. "My apology isn't for what I did. It's for how I acted afterward. For being a coward and pretending it didn't happen. For confusing you. That was unfair." I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up. This was not the speech I had rehearsed in my head. He wasn't apologizing for the touch itself, but for the retreat that followed. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope rekindled itself in the pit of my stomach. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice raspy. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I know, because I've been sending you nothing but mixed signals." He took a deep breath, the kind you take before a plunge into cold water. "The truth is, Lucas, I've been noticing you for months. Not just your voice, though. God, your voice is incredible." A faint blush colored his cheeks. "I noticed you. In the back row. Quiet. Kind of keeping to yourself. There was something." He gestured vaguely with his hands, struggling to find the words. "I kept telling myself to keep it professional. I'm the director. You're in the choir. There are lines you don't cross. But then I heard you sing that solo, and I knew I had to work with you. I told myself it was for the good of the cantata, but that was only part of it. I wanted an excuse to be near you, to talk to you." The revelation hung in the air between us, as tangible as the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeams. He had felt it too. This entire time, while I was admiring him from my safe distance, he had been looking back. The private rehearsals, the intense focus, it hadn't all been in my head. "That night," he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, "when you sang in the balcony. It was perfect. It was everything I had hoped for and more. And in that moment, I completely forgot about being the director. I forgot about all the rules I had made for myself. All I could think was that I needed to touch you, to hold on to that moment with you." His gaze was steady now, full of a terrifying vulnerability. "When I put my hands on your waist. That was me, Lucas. Not the conductor. Just me. And it scared the hell out of me. So I ran." The silence that followed was profound. He had laid it all bare. His fear, his feelings, the truth behind every interaction we'd had for the past week. He had just handed me his heart, and I could feel my own aching in response, overflowing with a relief so immense it almost brought me to my knees. All this time, I thought I was the only one who was afraid. "I was scared too," I whispered, and the confession felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for years. I thought I had imagined it all, that I was just projecting." A slow, beautiful smile spread across Julian's face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "You imagine nothing," he said softly. He raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently cupping my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, and this time, there was no ambiguity, no professional excuse. It was a simple, tender caress. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble, "what do we do now?" I didn't need to answer with words. I leaned in, closing the last inch of space between us, and kissed him. It was a tentative kiss at first, a question, but he answered immediately, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The kiss deepened, becoming confident and sure, a mutual acknowledgement of everything that had been simmering beneath the surface. It tasted of relief and hope and the faint, sweet flavor of communion wine. We were standing in the middle of a church, but in that moment, it felt like the most sacred ground on earth. We had finally found our harmony. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, monochrome dream into a world of vibrant color. The silent, predictable rhythm of my life was replaced by a new, exciting cadence. Leaving choir practice was no longer a solitary walk to my car, but a shared journey with Julian, our hands finding each other in the darkness of the parking lot. Our conversations started in the shadow of the church and continued over late-night coffee at a diner or sprawled on the floor of my once-empty apartment, surrounded by my design sketches. We learned each other in small, wonderful details. I learned that his focused intensity as a conductor gave way to a gentle, almost goofy sense of humor when he was relaxed. I learned he was a terrible cook but made the best coffee I'd ever tasted. He, in turn, learned about the quiet anxieties that drove me to my solitary work, and he seemed to have an innate sense of when to push me out of my shell and when to simply sit with me in comfortable silence. My apartment didn't feel like a hermitage anymore. It felt like a home, one that was increasingly filled with his laughter and the sound of him humming snippets of classical music while he browsed my bookshelves. We had to navigate the reality of our situation at the church. It was a conversation we both knew was necessary. One evening, sitting on my couch, he turned to me with a serious expression. "We need to tell the pastor," he said. "It's the right thing to do. I can't be your director and you're this," he said, gesturing between us. "It's not fair to anyone, least of all you." His willingness to potentially risk his position for the integrity of our new relationship spoke volumes. It turned out the pastor was a kind, understanding man who simply suggested Julian find a substitute to lead the tenor sectionals to avoid any direct conflict of interest, a solution that felt both wise and wonderfully accepting. The professional boundary was removed, replaced by the exciting, undefined territory of a personal one. A month or two later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Julian asked me to meet him at the church. When I arrived, the vast sanctuary was empty, bathed in the soft, hazy light of late spring. "What are we doing here?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly. He just smiled and took my hand, leading me toward the narrow, winding staircase. "There's something I want to try again," he said, a playful glint in his eye. We climbed the stone steps to the organ balcony. It was just as I remembered it, dusty, cramped, and filled with a palpable sense of history. I walked to the railing and looked down, the pews stretching out below. I felt a familiar warmth as Julian came to stand behind me, his body a perfect fit against my back. And then, his hands came to rest on my waist, in the exact same spot as they had that first night. But this time, everything was different. There was no tension, no uncertainty, no fear. His hold was firm, comfortable, and deeply reassuring. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his arms wrapped securely around me. It wasn't an impulsive, questioning gesture anymore. It was a statement. This is where I belong. This is us. We stood there for a long time, in the silence, simply holding each other. It was a perfect, quiet reaffirmation of the moment that had changed everything, a beautiful grace note at the end of a tumultuous musical phrase. I had joined that choir searching for a voice, a way to be heard in a world where I felt largely invisible. I was hoping to find a small connection, a way to feel like a part of a community, to be one voice among many. I never imagined that in the process, I would find one particular person who saw me, truly saw me, even when I was trying my best to hide in the back row. Life is funny like that, isn't it? You go looking for something small, for a little less silence, and sometimes you find everything. You discover that the most profound connections aren't always made in the grand, triumphant crescendos, but in the quiet pauses in between. It's in those breathless, uncertain moments that you find out who you really are and who you're meant to be with. I learned that vulnerability isn't a weakness to be hidden. It's the key that unlocks the most beautiful harmony of all.